I am unashamed. What about you?
That's where he started.
Yeah, he started in the right place.
We were talking about our old pal, Robichaux, who we just had on the podcast, and how much we enjoyed having him on. Zach, it's good to have you in-house again. This is twice within a month. This is like we're breaking records here.
We're doing it. Well, I heard you guys were getting into Matthew or Mark 13. And I was like, I better come.
I better make a trip to Louisiana.
So I've been waiting for days to say this. I didn't know I was going to do it in person, but that's what got you here now is the threat of an eschatological discussion.
Well, what's funny is me and my wife got in a big fight last week on this topic.
Did it come to blows or?
It got heated. I walk in and she's in the kitchen.
Everybody listening, I'm sure it was just.
That's why y'all like each other so much, because y'all have regular rounds with your.
Oh, this got rowdy because I came in. She's in the kitchen, and I'd been studying for the podcast on this Mark 13 passage because there's a lot of meat here.
Yeah,
and it gets very controversial. So there's a Jesus is on the Mount of Olives and he's preaching. He's giving like this discourse, and it's known in the theological community as the Olivet Discourse.
Yeah,
and so
he was on the Mount of Olives.
Yeah, he's on the Mount of Olives. So I said, man, the more I read about the Olivet Discourse, I just get so fired up. And she's like, the what? I said, the Olivet Discourse. She goes, oh, do tell us, Zach, about the Olivet. And then she starts, you and your big words. I'm like, what? Man.
This was crazy. I've actually heard of that, I guess, in my research, but I'd heard that before.
But she joined in right where we where we left off.
And I was already bitter about it. So then I like unleash, and I'm like, this is what's wrong with, and then it just got heated. It got really heated.
Well, that's what I love about Jill. She's got a way that get to Zach that nobody else can, which that makes her special. So I wanted to show you this. I did want to thank you guys. So apparently my wasp sting episode, there's a lot, now it's all over Facebook.
Oh, that's a great gift.
So somebody gave me this. This was laying on my desk. I went in to preach yesterday, and so an anonymous gift of a bug swatter. But if we'd had this thing, Jace, we'd have been, because this thing electrifies at the same time.
Who gave you that?
I don't know. Somebody at our church. It was laying on my desk. So
I'm going to have to give credit. I mean, in the last 2 weeks, I've gotten a brand new Bible that I was after for the last 5 years. And someone sent me a magnifying glass that is, it is a magnifying glass in a little leather.
I got one right here at all times.
We lost your mic, Phil.
Phil said everybody has to have a magnifying glass and that he has one right here.
As he walks away.
Yeah. Phil's entered that zone. You had back surgery, and the first few days were bumpy.
Oh, yeah, we got to hear from him.
But now,
when he comes back, we'll ask him.
I've noticed him and Si have something in common. Once they've escaped, death and surgeries and all these, they're just like, I'm going to do whatever I want to do.
Get up in the middle of the podcast, it don't matter.
Get up in the middle. Yeah, I'm on.
I want a cup of coffee.
Yesterday, I was preaching about the resurrection. I was getting on a pretty good little run, and I was talking about, we've talked about a lot on the podcast, all the things that Jesus did, post-resurrection. Yeah. So I'm getting into it, and I'm back and forth, and I'm getting some stuff back from the audience. And finally, the last one I said, and he flew out of here. Literally, I said, you think Superman's something? And all of a sudden I hear from the back, that's the way I'm going out of here. And it was Si.
I said, who in the world was that? I looked up, it was old Si there looking.
He was yelling. And then he said, I said, that's right, Si. I said, Si's flying out of here. And I said, Si, you won't even need oxygen.
Oh, yeah. They call that a shout-back church. Shout-back church.
So you hear a lot of offers out there for free iPhones that sounds too good to be true, which it is, because just like freedom itself, nothing is free. Mobile phone companies not only lock you into long-term contracts, but they also bill the price of the phone into your bill with hidden fees. And if you've been doing business with these guys for a while, you know that that's true. One of our sponsors, Patriot Mobile, can show you how to get the exact same iPhone, but interest-free without the games and no contract. Patriot Mobile is America's only Christian conservative wireless provider. They offer nationwide coverage on the best 4G and 5G networks because they use the same towers as the major guys. So you get the same great service while supporting a company that's fighting to preserve our God-given rights and freedoms. They believe in the same things that we do. Patriot Mobile also offers performance guarantee. If you're not happy with your coverage, you can switch to either of the 3 carriers they provide for free. Go to patriotmobile.com/Phil, or you can call 972-PATRIOT. Their customer service is 100% U.S. based. You get free activation today with the offer code Phil. So if you're fed up with the woke, it's time to go with Patriot Mobile. And you can do that at patriotmobile.com/Phil, or you can call 972-PATRIOT.
Phil, are you better?
Yeah,
Oh,
give us
what are
an
you
up-
talking
Give
about?
us a
an update.
report.
Yeah.
Phil.
I said this yesterday to the brothers who had gathered up there. The heart surgeon was there, and we converted him, he and his wife.
Was he a consultant on the back issue? Do you consult?
He was the one that they said, what about this, Mr. Robertson? He's got, what do you call it when you dehydrate? So I threw up about 4 or 5 times after that hunt on the elm hole.
I witnessed that. So your back was hurting, but all of a sudden you started.
Then, what do you got a stomach?
He looked at the whole thing, and they said, I don't know this guy, dehydration, but things go up, and they had names for it, but things go down. Is he ready for the operation?
some EKG issues, yeah.
But the heart surgeon, Sampanero, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and Greg Sampanero are the ones I run with.
And the heart surgeon.
Heart surgeon. He said,
Dad
he'll
said
be all
that,
right.
Dad
He'll be
said
all
that
right.
at CPAC one year.
Well,
Zach.
you're
The needle they used for a perforated, what's
injection.
the backbone. What's it made up of? It's
For your vertebrae.
vertebrae.
Yep.
The tool they use, and I kept thinking, well, how could one little needle being bored down in my back? I mean, it's a big thing, but then they informed me that the needle was about the size of this pen here.
Ooh.
So
Because there's an incision on your
it's
back.
that big a hole going into your back. So I told him, I just stopped the whole proceeding and said, look, for all you brothers who are Christian people, I said, you are to be lifted up as being men and women in the medical profession that alleviate the pain of your neighbors. I think to me, it was love for God, love for your neighbor. These people who work in the health profession, I mean, they deserve a salute to say
I agree.
Because we're
they are
only
well
we're
trained.
about 5 days after the surgery. And
Look,
you're
I
back
was
at it.
just misery.
It was Wednesday.
Yeah, 5
right?
days. Yeah.
5 days.
I went through misery. I mean, in and out of the bed was a major thing. Just crawl. I mean, it was rough.
Oh, we lived every day I went home, and Missy's like, "Well, how's your dad?" I was like, "He's literally crawling around on the floor of the blind in agony." She's like, "Why don't y'all just tell him not to come?" I was like, "Do you want to tell him?" So now that you're
I missed
feeling,
a few days in duck season, but not many. But the
You know why
heart
you
surgeon,
know
he
why
had
they
it
didn't
right.
tell you not to come, Dad? Because of the code. The Robertson code. You don't tell other
I think I
Robertson
brought-
men what to do.
I think I broke the code. I did tell him a few times, but I'm not sure he was listening. But
he was still going by the
speaking
code.
of that, I was told by the former duck hunt coordinator, now the deer manager.
I didn't realize it was a full job switch.
Well, here's the issue, and I shared that story on some podcast,
On one of the last podcasts.
4 or 5, that you don't want to if all of you who are part of a hunting club, you don't want a deer manager running the duck coordination on the hunts.
That's right.
Is it a conflict of interest?
Yeah, it's a conflict of interest. So anyway, he called me last night and he said, here's what I'm thinking. He said, you need to talk Phil into, and I said, hey, hang on right there. I'm not talking Phil into
Let me stop you.
anything.
We already got a
He said,
problem.
well, let me rephrase that. He said, I think that Phil, since he just had the back surgery, needs to shoot a 20 gauge instead of a 12 gauge. And I said, so what's next? Move him in the middle of the blind right next to Cy, in between the oxygen tank and Cy. And he's like, well, that's a
Dad,
thought.
if they ever move you to the middle, it's you're one step from not hunting.
There was a little conflict on the discussion of there's a large difference between managers and owners.
Yeah, Kate told me last night.
You know, we got about
Phil
a
said,
several
he
$1 million
still calls us.
enterprise.
So now they're telling you, Phil, they're recommending what shotgun you shoot because here's their thought. A 12 gauge is the recoil for all you non-hunters that are listening. The recoil on a 12 gauge is more substantial than a 20 gauge.
With the
Even though you would
the
think
gas operated is still
no, those guns they kick.
Okay.
And especially but I was going to explain that just because you'd think a 20 gauge is bigger because it's a bigger number, but it's actually
the higher the number, the less.
Yeah, in the gun world, it's the opposite. Really, it's a good question.
Only shotguns.
Just think about it, the lifestyle of some individuals in these United States of America, the lifestyle of some literally has evolved around guns and ammo. Tons of ammunition. I mean, all the safety working.
Our whole lives have been.
Our whole
Well,
lives.
Phil, I'm covering the globe with a metal detector, and the top 3 finds right in between, nails and beer cans are bullets.
Yep.
Or bullet casings.
Some people look down on that, but if you look at it, from a Christian perspective, salt water is their big hero, but they still say somewhere in there, salt water built not only a lot of fish. I see that coming out of salt water, but I don't see ducks or me coming out of salt water. I just don't see it.
Or the ability to come up with ammo and all that.
So I take it you're not switching to the 20
You're
gauge.
going to stick with.
We'll be all right.
So says the owner of
The owner, not the manager.
not the manager.
All right, well, are y'all ready
The
to
man
get
who
into
fixed
this?
my back, when that topic came up, he said, I will in no capacity, or I do not have any authority to tell the duck commander that he can't shoot the shotgun he wants to shoot. That's the guy that worked on me. He said, so,
He didn't put any limits on it.
no, he said, it's up to you.
Well, and I do want to mention before we leave this,
Good people.
I got a lot of notes from Unashamed Nation and concerns for Dad, and a lot of you said you were praying for. So, Dad, you had thousands of people praying for you. So
It worked.
for that, we say thanks, and Dad's better, which is always good. The man stuff, he's been dealing with this 3 weeks now, a little over 3, and he only missed one of his classes at WFR that he teaches.
And he only missed about 3 days of duck season. We're in the split now.
Right.
So
Which helps
that's
during the healing
well,
process.
he's not even tempted to go. And look,
I drove over this morning. This happened on 2 days before duck season. So this happened on about November the 15th, right before duck season. It's when I wrenched my back and the vertebra, collapsed to a certain degree. But it took me about a couple of weeks to finally say, I think I'm going to need some medical.
Yep, that's
help on
called
this.
stubbornness.
It's a big move for me to make.
Yeah.
So I go up there, and then they look at it, and they lay it down on what's the problem. And the guy said, and this guy plays, he's a previous,
Georgia Bulldog.
Georgia Bulldog. I said, you know what? I said, forget LSU for a few minutes. Let's go with his back. And how are you?
Go Dogs.
How are you with backs? You done strapped the Tigers one time too many, I guess. I said, but hey. So he said, we can fix it. So I really think we don't give them enough credit.
No, you're right.
Skill set of individuals who give their life to alleviate the pain of their neighbor.
Yeah, it's a gift. I also want to mention that Dad is at WFR every Sunday, 9 o'clock. We have an Unashamed Bible study, and you basically lay out the gospel every Sunday. And so yesterday I was preaching, so I was there, and I ran up on 2 soaking wet people when I came in.
Yep.
I said, well, it looks like y'all must have taken the big splash here. And they said, yeah, your dad. I said, did Dad baptize y'all? And I was worried then. They said, well, Burley did the heavy lifting, but your dad had a hand on the shoulder. I said, all right. So Burley was kind of doing
they
those.
drove one group from Saskatchewan.
Saskatchewan.
I said, we shoot mallard ducks and we eat them. I said, but a lot of them have little bracelets on their little feet. And I said, it says Saskatchewan. We look it up, Saskatchewan. You get on the computer, and they'll tell you when that duck was banded, how old he was, and where he ended up. I said, some of them end up here. I said, they never leave here alive and get back to Canada. I said, however, if y'all drove all the way down here from Saskatchewan, and they did, to be baptized, I said, you are in the right place.
Well, he told me they'd come down to visit some family in Tennessee. And he said, we figured since we were in the neighborhood, Tennessee, that they'd come on down. I said, well, I guess when you're from Saskatchewan, Tennessee's the neighborhood. So, yeah, we met him yesterday. Congratulations.
Great guy. So now he has eternal life, and it's for sure.
There you go. I love it. Let's take a break. So we all know that this last year was momentous because Roe versus Wade was overturned. And, of course, the battle still goes on. It's just now at the state level, and it'll still be at the federal level as well. So we know that. No group in America is better positioned to help us in this battle than 40 Days for Life. They have 1 million volunteers in 1,000 cities. They hold peaceful vigils outside abortion facilities, and they have a large presence in a lot of the blue states where we still see a lot of abortion. So because they're peaceful vigils, they've caused the abortion no-show rate to go as high as 75%, which is huge. And they've also helped close 106 abortion businesses in America. So they're changing hearts, they're changing minds, they're making a big difference. And we want to join these guys and be a part of the action. So check out their locations. You might want to volunteer and, participate in one of their prayer vigils. They've got a podcast, which is excellent. They have a free magazine that you can get as well. And you go to 40daysforlife.com to be able to get access to this information and also to stay updated on what's going on in post-Roe America. So that's 40daysforlife.com, 40daysforlife.com. All right, so we're ready to dive into Mark 13 today. We got Zach here from North Carolina, which is always good. I think we'll reset the stage that got us to here because we've had a couple of podcasts in between.
Well, here's the problem, I think, and the reason we're building this up is controversial, is because people just come to Mark 13 to talk about Mark 13.
Or Matthew 24, right?
And you're like, well, wait a minute here. I mean, if you just go back to Mark 11 and where he clears out the temple, so, that's not, only in the book of John is the clearing of the temple early.
Right.
But the other three, I'm pretty sure about that, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they have it right here.
Right, because John just covers basically the last week of Jesus' life, whereas these guys
John kind of starts here.
Right.
Exactly. But, and I have, notes about, because I really like how John, recorded this, when Jesus talked about the temple referring to his body in John 2. And we can look at that in detail, because when he said, they were looking around like, when he made that claim about the temple's going to be destroyed and not one stone be left on another, and then it says parenthetically that he was talking about his body,
right,
that he would raise up in 3 days,
right.
And I think that's a key.
No, it is.
It is a very key moment.
And I'll take one step back further too, Jay. So this starts. Obviously, he's coming into Jerusalem to begin the process of why he came, and this is all about him setting the stage. I came to die. Dad, he mentions it in Mark 8.
By the way, while you're there, in other words, he makes a comment about the healing of a boy with an evil spirit. I love this one. He just right after this says, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They'll kill him, and after 3 days, he will rise. Just before that, the healing of the boy with an evil spirit. from childhood, they said to Jesus, this boy's had this problem. He said he's often thrown him into the fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything to take pity on us and help us. And Jesus' response was, if you can. I mean, to me, that was the power of the text that you are reading. Jesus said, I'm fixing to die, be buried. That's the goal that I'm here. But they were slow in getting it. But at the end, go preach the gospel to all the creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved. It's not rocket science.
No. And so as he comes in, so a couple of things happen. One is he raises Lazarus from the dead. Remember from John 11. That's huge because now all of a sudden we're out there. There are a bunch of people there. They see this happen. So now word has begun to spread. He comes into Jerusalem, and the first thing he does is he goes into the temple. And I mean, he, goes after him. We talked about that.
Which is a big, that's big because that's the context. It's because it's called, in my Bible, the heading is the triumphal entry of Jesus. So this is Jesus, as we mentioned in a previous podcast. His ministry is going public. He's done all this stuff in the past, and he's told, when he's performed miracles, he's told him to be quiet, not tell anybody. But this is the moment where he's going public, and it's worthy of note that the first place that he goes is the temple.
Correct.
That's where he goes.
Right.
He goes into the temple. And then Mark's account is, I think Mark says he goes in the temple, looks around, leaves, comes back.
Right, the next day.
The high priest has arrived, but nobody knows it.
Yeah.
The high priest at this point.
So when we were in
Exactly.
Mark 11 and 12, every group that's represented in the temple, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the teachers of the law, all of them come and take him on, right? Every one of those different groups comes and tries to trap him or trick him. And we know behind the scenes, we keep getting these little thoughts that they're plotting to kill him, which he knows that. And that even started and the reason I mentioned him raising Lazarus, Jace, is because that started then. Remember, as soon as he raised him up, they said they started a plot to kill Jesus and Lazarus.
Remember, the same bunch at the temple that's been after him, I mean, he's fixing to do away with all of it,
Right.
including them.
Well, and I feel like I need to read this. I mean, we're just leading up to Mark 13. So when he cleared out the temple in Mark 11. So when you go to John and actually read that in John 2, he goes into the temple courts in verse 12, and you remember they had there was a bunch of animals there because they had brought their animals to be sacrificed. Probably bought them there. They had the money exchange.
It's a commerce, right?
Yeah, it's a house of trade, and he's looking around here, and so and it's not. We tend to think that he was angry, but when you look in the Greek, when in verse 17, his disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." I mean, zeal. He was showing his zeal, and you say, what was he zealous for? He was zealous for humanity, for people, because then he's the one that came up with this example of I'm the temple. You destroy this body. Verse 18, then the Jews demanded, what miraculous sign can you show us to prove you have authority to do all this? Jesus said, destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days. And in my research, I listened to a sermon, and he had 4 points, and I loved it. He really wasn't talking about Mark 13, but he was talking about John 2. And I wrote these down. Christ's body was the destroyed temple when he broke his body on the cross for us. His body, post-resurrection, was the rebuilt temple.
Correct.
It was, rebuilt is not a good enough word, but whatever that was, for the body to come back.
He was dead, now he's alive.
Now he's alive.
Glorified.
So now, based on that happening, there is a new location for holiness. It's not this building of rocks. Because you got to remember, back in their day, it was where it was the center, not just of their faith and their religion and the presence of God, but of their politics and of their, in this case, even their commerce. It was the central location for everything. Well, now the new location for true holiness is Jesus.
Yeah. Well, it's his presence. So the temple or the tabernacle was where heaven and earth met, and then in Jesus now you have the incarnation of God Himself in flesh. So there's this incredible, like, it's a paradigm shift. I mean, it's not even a paradigm shift. I don't think we have words in the English language to describe what's happening here.
Right. And the fourth thing was God's salvation had now become universal. It wasn't just localized to the Jews. So you just think about that. That's what
You incorporate the Gentile world into the whole apparatus when Jesus. Think about it, Jace. With the Jews, how long have they had this power? 1,000 years, maybe, pretty close to it, when the temple was built, and then
it was built. Solomon built the.
Well, I think in like 580.
This is a shock.
586. I can't believe that number popped in my head, but I think that's accurate. It actually
was destroyed,
and so they started.
I think it was 587.
Okay, give or take. And then it started being rebuilt.
That's
but look,
and it took about 90 years. That's Ezra, Nehemiah. That's that process.
Which is important because when you hear some of the language, the apocalyptic language here in Mark 13, it's very familiar and it sounds a lot like the apocalyptic language that was written in Isaiah to prophesy about the coming of the destruction of the temple in 587.
Yeah. Well, before we get there, so I'm just getting us there. So then you had this.
Hang on, Jason. Let's take a break. All right.
Then you had this withered fig tree. It's not a parable, but what incident? Which we talked about what that represents.
Yep.
Which is we're still going to the power
and inclusion of the Gentiles.
Yeah, of this. We're moving on from just Judaism and the Jewish nationalistic religion. Then he tells this parable. There's no doubt who he's talking about here in chapter 12, where you remember about he planted a vineyard and the wall around, he dug a pit, and then he rented the vineyard to some farmers and went away on a journey. He gives this vision, this parable of him sending prophets and to teach, and they kill them all. They even sent his son. They kill him too. And at the end of it, you remember in verse 12, it said they looked for a way to arrest him because they knew he had spoken the parable against them. And all this is going on, going back to 11:27 in the temple courts when he's walking around the temple courts talking with the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. This is what's happening here. He cannot be any more specific in throwing haymakers than what he's throwing.
And by the way, Jess, before you leave that, if you read the sister comparison in Matthew records he did a bunch of other parables with that same theme. So he's making a strong point that this whole dispensation, this whole era, everything the way it's been is coming to an end. This is something new. And that's the point over and over and over.
So you jump to 12:35. Look, he's still teaching in the temple courts. And you remember that we went through this about Christ coming through, being the son of David, and which is all, in reference to this prophecy that there's a Messiah coming in the line of David.
Right.
And so even in the last place in 41 before we get here, when Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. And he gives this analogy about this woman giving all she had as being more true to all the people in flowing robes and trying to use their wealth for the same reason he ran them out of the temple 2 chapters ago.
It's a clear picture.
Her offering was a fraction of a penny.
Yeah.
It's the clear picture of a heart of the widow versus the heart of these other folks.
Now, look, I know that was a quick review, but we've done previous podcasts on all those in specific. But I feel like you have to do that before you read 13, because now it says, as he was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones And that's why I read that in John 2 when he said, not one stone will be left on another.
Yeah.
Look, this is not some kind of illustration. They're looking, and he's like, look at this. I mean, it was I mean, you can look at, recreations and art. It's out there online. You can say, I mean, it was a piece of work.
Spectacular.
What massive stones, what magnificent buildings. Do you see all these great buildings, replied Jesus? Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. Now, I just want to stop right here and before I keep reading and say, do you realize the power of what Jesus says here? Because what year are we talking about here? This
It would have been 30
33
AD.
or, 30, I guess.
Well, 32, yeah.
Do you realize that he said that, and 40 years later, there was not one stone left on another? So wherever you go and how you treat the rest of what we're reading, I think it's significant that you have a person that we've put our faith and trust in, who is able to tell you something that it may not mean as much to us today because we're not looking at the building, but go find a picture of it.
Yeah.
And him saying, there's not one stone going to be left on another.
Yeah,
and then 40 years later, in history, whether you're a believer in the Bible or not, in the history books, there was not one stone left on another 40 years later in history. In any history book, you can prove that.
Right.
So I just think that's significant. So then it says, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives.
Hold on, let me
Okay, go ahead.
back up what you just said too, because not to steal the thunder from the end of this, but I think it's good at the beginning to see this as two big parentheses around this conversation, because we're going to get into this what Jesus said, but obviously, great point you just made. At the end of this discourse, he says this. He says, "Truly," it's in verse 30 of Mark 13. "Truly, I say to you, this generation." Which, by the way, do you know how long a generation was in Jewish history and Jewish culture? 30 to 40 years.
Right.
So what he's saying here, truly I say this to you, that this is all going to happen in the next 30 to 40 years. He says, truly I say to you, this generation, a generation lasts 30 to 40 years, will not pass away until all these things have taken place. So whatever we're going to get into here,
In between,
you have to get what Jase had mentioned at the beginning of this. They're looking at the physical temple of Israel and Jesus, and they're marveling at how magnificent it is. And Jesus is like, yeah, that's all.
I appreciate it, but it wasn't my thought. I mean,
No, it's in the Bible. I mean, you
I just read it. But what Zach's point is, and a lot of you who don't know why this is so controversial, what we're fixed to read, you're like, well, what's the big deal? Well, people don't read these first 3 verses when they're having these discussions, nor do they read verse 30. They just jump to the middle and say, now, let me explain to you when this is going to happen and how it's going to happen. And look, and I went through it ad nauseum because I wanted to read and listen to what other people think before I.
But with our parentheses in Scripture around this event that's going to take place, we can narrow it down to within a 30 to 40 year window.
Yeah, that I would think
from
based
when he
on
said
what
it.
we've read so far. Now, I did wear my shirt today on purpose since we were going through Mark 13.
You got it.
For you that can't see it, I could be wrong, but I'm fairly certain. Look, I'm 99.999% that, and the only reason I'm not saying 100 is if this was somehow,
Unless it's
misrecorded, that he was looking at a building and they were discussing an actual structure here when he said, do you see all these great buildings? I mean, I don't know how much clearer you can
get. Think about this too, and I didn't know when to bring this up, but I'm going to bring it up now because I want to let this sink in. It's this kind of language that got Jesus killed.
Oh, there's no doubt about that.
Because he's whatever and it's the same thing. I turned over here. We know in Acts 17, Paul says this, but also in what got Stephen killed in Acts 7. Listen to what he says here. He says, our forefathers, says Acts 7:44, Our forefathers had the tabernacle of testimony in the wilderness, just as he who spoke to Moses directed him to make it according to the pattern which he had seen. And then he goes on to talk about these buildings that God dwelt in, but it was Solomon who built a house for him, the temple, right? This is what Stephen says. However, this is a big point. However, the Most High does not dwell in houses made by human hands. As the prophet says, heaven is my throne and earth is the footstool of my feet. What kind of house will you build for me, says the Lord? Or what place is there for my repose? Was it not my hand which made all these things? This is, when Stephen said this, by the way, this is what got him killed. It's the same thing that got Jesus killed. And I know this is controversial, but I think it matters because this is a theme that is throughout the entire Bible, that runs through the Bible. There's this place called the temple that they thought this is where God lives. And God's like, no. And when Jesus shows up, because they thought they could contain God in their building, they made a mockery of it. They made it a den of robbers. Jesus saw what they did to his quote unquote house and was like furious, flips over the tables, but really for the purpose of declaring what he's about to declare here.
Well, that's why I said, I think because he had a zeal for people. Yeah. I mean, when you look at the Greek and break that word down, it was more, God wants to live with and in people.
Well, and that's ultimately what happens, by the way, because you have the temple of Jesus is the temple, and then we become the temple. 1 Corinthians chapter 6 says we're the temple.
Oh, I want to mention something about that. But let's
I have
we're the
verses.
bricks that hold the temple.
All right, go ahead, Al.
And let's take a break. Welcome back to Unashamed. 'Tis the season, as they say. It's Christmas time, which is always a favorite. I do love giving people ideas about things they can get. And if you go to philmerch.com, use the promo code Phil20. Got a lot of Unashamed gear that's there. Make great gifts. There's some uncanceled stuff there. Love Always Protects is a great T-shirt. So if you're looking at a Christmas idea, check out philmerch.com. Use the promo code Phil20. To save you some money and get a great gift. So I just want to mention the historical irony of this, that we're talking about this, we're reading this passage that was mentioned 2,000 years ago. But if you go to Israel, and Jase, you've been there, today, you go to Jerusalem. So we're talking about December 2022. What you have is not only the Jewish people hanging on to where the temple used to be, still as a central part of who they are. You've got
I saw it happen.
You've got Islam claiming that this is their Mecca because there's a mosque there, and then you've got a lot of people in Christianity claiming, no, wait a minute, this is our spot as well because we're all going to come back here. Yeah. So in that one spot, you've got three groups of people that have missed what you just said, Dad. That it's not about a place or a building anymore. It's about us. It's about the temple.
Which is what Paul said, what Stephen said, and what Jesus said.
There's 2 points I want to make before I get back to reading Mark. Is one, Zach read when Stephen, right before he died, but that was also the reason he was seized. If you back up another chapter to Acts chapter 6, in verse 11, it says, Then they secretly persuaded some men to say, We have heard Stephen speak words of blasphemy against Moses and against God. Well, I wonder what they mean about that. Well, he explains it. So they stirred up the people and the elders and the teachers of the law. They seized Stephen and brought him in before the Sanhedrin. Now listen to what the accusation is. They produced false witnesses who testified, This fellow never stopped speaking against this holy place and against the law. But we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and change the customs Moses handed down to us.
Okay.
And this is all post-resurrection.
Yeah. And by the way, we have not compared notes. I just think that's interesting.
No, I had the Act 6. You had the Act 7. But now, I think reading both of them,
that makes it more because it builds the story of what's going on here.
Look, when he took on that temple, they got riled up.
Oh yeah,
But look, I do think,
which is why he did it.
Yeah.
I heard one of these scholars say, and I agree with it, that he said, you got to remember, it would be like an American, because it's hard for the Western culture now to identify this. He said, but this would be like if you had take the 4 buildings of America, he had if you just
Pentagon.
if you took
Congress,
the
the White House.
if you took all that and combined them into one, this is their temple.
Yeah.
This is the hub.
It's the symbol of them as a people.
Then you're like, oh. So if you go around threatening that, well, what would they call you here?
insurrection.
Well, yeah, you're an insurrection. You're a terrorist.
You're extremists.
Yeah, you're extremist. This will kill you if you're going to tackle this. So I do think we do need to have that
That's
conversation.
actually a good illustration because when you think about it, when the founders started out, I mean, they're in Philadelphia. I mean, the idea of liberty and freedom was for the people, of the people, for the people, by the people. It never was about structures. Yeah. So that's a great illustration.
Is the cornerstone of the building.
Now I know we're setting this up. Yeah, we're set, and Phil, to your point, I was going to read same idea that we're fast forwarding to the practical application of Jesus in that Jesus said, "I'm the temple. My body. I'm going to give it for all people. The resurrection is going to show that we can live forever." I'm tearing down this location principle of worship and the presence of God, and you giving these sacrifices to make up for your sin. I'm the sacrifice. And so when you fast forward to the end, I'll just pick one verse that Paul gave reference to in 1 Corinthians 3:16 when he said, "Don't you know?" Now we're fast forwarding now. This is post-resurrection. This is the Spirit being poured out. Jesus is ascended to the right hand of God. And he says in verse 16 of 1 Corinthians 3, Paul says, "Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit lives in you?" Well, doesn't this sound awfully familiar to John 14 when he said, "Look, I'm gonna leave. I'm gonna go in my Father's house are many rooms." And remember that discourse? And he said, "Look, but I'm not gonna leave you as orphans. I'm gonna provide a counselor, the Spirit. He'll be in you." John 14 says that. Well, we fast forward to Paul's application here, and he says the same thing. Well, verse 17 says, "If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him, for God's temple is sacred." And you're like, oh, well, see, he's talking about the temple is sacred. And you are that temple. That was the transition that Jesus brought. It's a way better story.
And it's better. And here's why.
You look at it logically with our fellow religious people running around, I can see how it would kind of go to their head. Magnificent structure, never realizing they were just one brick at a time.
Yeah.
Kind of like the Pink Floyd didn't know anything about it.
Another brick in the
wall.
Go ahead, Zach.
I'm just glad to be one brick in the wall.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and I've said this a lot. I think I said this on the podcast before. The reason why this matters is because we're talking about God's presence. At the end of the day, where does God live?
Yeah.
Where does God dwell? It's not in temples built by man's hands. God doesn't need the temple. He's not going to be bound to that. But for us, it's important because if you think about having to go to a place to meet God, it's the same thing that happened with the woman at the well. What'd she say? Where do we worship? On the mountain or in Jerusalem? He's like, you don't get it. A time is coming, and in fact, the time is now here when you'll worship the Father neither on that mountain nor in Jerusalem. He wants worshipers who will worship him in truth and spirit. It's God's presence in you. Now, I am the temple. God lives in me by the power of the Holy Spirit, and I think that's important because many. I think what's happening in the church is when we get off on this, then we get so hampered down on justification, which is important, and the atonement. But the atonement of our sin and the justification of our sin is a means to an end. It's not the end itself. The end is be in the presence of God.
Yeah.
And that's what that is the end of all of it, is to be in the presence of God.
So
hang on, let's take a break.
So having said that, I'm going to read this.
Hang on, before you read that, I just want to make one comment because that was a huge illustration you used for a lot of different reasons people don't realize, because Jesus made it very clear to that Samaritan woman that what he was about to do. The reason she said that is because Solomon, who built the first temple, his son, they split the kingdom. Jeroboam built another temple in Samaria. So then the people in Samaria, which temple do we go to? Do we go to this one or go to that one? So again, that's how confusing it is when you start talking about temples versus just being Christ. So anyway, I'm going
to read this, and the reason we're making such a big deal about the temple is because the controversy from what I'm fixed to read really has nothing to do with that temple. It has to do with whether this is the second coming or the final coming of Jesus, or this is something that Jesus accomplished when he was resurrected and ascended to the right hand of God, which was the new temple of the Holy Spirit dwelling in people here. So
that's what makes it a differing view. You're right. Because a lot of people think it's the final coming.
So let me read back up and read 13, 2 and 3 again. So he said, do you see all these great buildings? Replied Jesus. Not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, opposite the temple.
So that's
a key phrase, because they're sitting there looking at it.
The Olivet Discourse, guys. This is what we call this.
They're looking at it. So Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, tell us, when will these things happen? Because they're wondering, what's all this not one stone on another? When will this happen? And what will be the sign that they are about to be fulfilled? Jesus said, watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name claiming I am he, and he will deceive many. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There'll be earthquakes in various places, and famines. These are the beginning of birth pains. Now, I'm just going to stop so you can catch your breath. All of a sudden, in a few verses, you're like, wait a minute, what just happened? It's like, what? We were talking about the temple. We were talking about not one stone would be left on another. It would be destroyed. They said, give us the signs, or a sign, or when will this happen? And then all of a sudden, he starts talking about the end. He starts talking about nation rising against nation and kingdom against kingdom and earthquakes happening, rumors of wars. Well, it gets worse. Then he says, you must be on your guard. You will be handed over to the local councils and flogged in the synagogues on account of me, and you will stand before governors and kings as witnesses to them. Because now all of a sudden, we're back to him talking to them.
Very specific.
So just, he didn't lose his way. You know, I mean, this is Jesus speaking. And
let me comment on that, Jace, because I think it's a huge point, because he gives them a general look. And so what's happened is people through time have said, oh, here it is. Here's this war. Here's this earthquake. Here's this whatever.
That's what's happening today.
That's what I'm saying. So, exactly. but what I think, you can take this the other way, which is the way I take it. He's saying, look, things are going to be happening. I mean, things that people look to for signs, and this is going to happen. Over this 40 years, things are going to happen. But then he goes back to specific.
I would say it could be something else too, though. It could be, I think he's referencing the same apocalyptic language that was in Isaiah's prophecy of the.
Well, true. Well, we're going to get to that. Let me go ahead and just read it, and then we're going to have a part 2 on this, I guess. But so verse 10, he says,
we are.
Look, verse 10 says, and the gospel must first be preached to all nations. Another huge controversial thing we'll get to later. Whenever you are arrested and brought to trial, do not worry beforehand about what to say. Now, I love this. Just say whatever is given you at the time, for it is not you speaking, but the Holy Spirit. Because he's looking, and then the next 40 years, you know what's also going to happen? And it's literally going to happen way before, in the next few days, is the Holy Spirit is going to be poured out and made available. Right. Brother will betray brother to death, father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. All men will hate you because of me, but he who stands firm to the end will be saved. Now look, is he talking about their end or our end? I would say he's talking about they're in.
Because everything mentioned there happened to all
Exactly. And to Zach's point, verse 30 is this generation won't pass away before you see these things. Now, 14, we get into this. I dubbed this, what did I write down? Heavenly language describing terrestrial events. How you like that? So that's why the movie got it wrong. You know, the extraterrestrial, they just had a little thing that looked like an alien, but extraterrestrial would be God, Jesus, or the Holy Spirit.
Oh, angels, demons, right? Yeah.
So, because then it says, verse 14, when you see the abomination that causes desolation, which is a phrase used in the Old Testament, there's multiple references.
Mostly in the book of Daniel, but yeah.
Yeah, standing where it does not belong, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the roof of his house go down or enter the house.
Hold on, let me stop right there.
Anything out.
Think about this. Why? So if this is talking about the second coming of Christ, why in the world would you tell the believers to flee to the mountains?
Yeah.
It's the second coming.
Correct.
Why would you say flee?
Yeah, it doesn't work.
I think that's a key point
It's
here.
a big
No, I agree. So, verse 16, let no one in the field go back and get his cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for the pregnant women, nursing mothers. Pray that this will not take place in winter, because those will be days of distress unequaled from the beginning when God created the world until now, and never be equaled again. I mean, but just put it in context. For this world, this is, and what happened in AD 70?
It's coming. He's telling them it's
Complete
coming.
destruction. So watch, verse 20. If the Lord had not cut short those days, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect whom he has chosen, he has shortened them. At that time, if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will appear and perform signs and miracles to deceive the elect, if that were possible. So be on your guard. I have told you everything ahead of time, but in those days, following that distress, now we have a reference of Isaiah 13 here, 10, and Isaiah 34:4. The sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Now, obviously, we have a figurative picture of wrath and destruction.
Yeah, because when this was prophesied by the prophet Isaiah about the destruction of the temple in 587, none of this literally happened, right? This is all, so like the sun, the moon, all that didn't literally happen. This is, I heard one guy say it like this. This is apocalyptic language. The way you could describe that would be like if I said, man, I'd give an arm and a leg for that. Well, I'm not going to be a paraplegic to obtain whatever the thing. It's language that's being used to drive the point home.
Same thing Jesus said would gouge out your eye.
Well, I heard an analogy. It'd be like if you came up with a bunch of sports references talking about, throwing an interception or a Hail Mary and, the comeback and the dynasty is over, but you had never heard of sports whatsoever. You'd be like, whoa, what now?
What's going on here?
I mean, their legacy is over. The dynasty's been broken. And I mean, it's that kind of language, but people who are familiar with Isaiah and Ezekiel and
they got it. They understood.
They got the picture of what's happening. Let me finish just reading this section. So at that time, verse 26, men will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Look, clearly a reference to Daniel 7, which is where we started with all this kingdom talk about Jesus coming. So when people say, what kind of coming was this in reference to? He's here, and this is what he's bringing.
Yeah, and most people see that as the second coming.
Exactly.
Read 27, then we're going to have to.
And he will send his angels and gather the elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heavens. And then look, he references the lesson from the fig tree that we had brought up before. And I have to read what Zach read before in verse 30. I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away.
All right.
I know we can't do it now.
We got to take it to overtime.
And the next podcast, and in overtime, but we'll bring it up in the next podcast too. We need to talk about Daniel 7.
Yeah, we will.
No, we're getting to
Because
Daniel
that's
7.
the-
Let's
if-
just talk
if you-
about it in overtime.
If you don't understand Daniel 7 and which direction Christ is going in Daniel 7, you're going to miss Mark 13.
No,
All right, so you want to follow us over. This is a great discussion. blazetv.com/unashamed to our overtime, and then we'll talk more about this on the next podcast as well.
Thanks for listening to the Unashamed podcast. Help us out by rating us on iTunes. And don't miss an episode by subscribing on YouTube, and be sure to click that little bell to get notified about new episodes. And for even more content that you won't get anywhere else, subscribe to Blaze TV at blazetv.com/unashamed.